Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Townsend Center. My name's Stephen Best. I'm the director of the Townsend Center. We're pleased to host our colleague from History of Art, Aglaya Glebova, to discuss her new book, Aleksandr Rodchenko, Photography in the Time of Stalin. Today, Aglaya is in conversation with Harsha Ram, professor in the departments of Comparative Literature and Slavic Languages and Literatures. As is my habit, I want to draw your attention to a few things on our calendar. This evening, the poets Claudia Rankine and Pamela Sneed will discuss commemoration, memory, and storytelling in their poetic practice. That event was organized by Simon van Saarloos, an independent curator of public programming and a PhD student in our Department of Rhetoric. Rankine and Sneed's conversation will take place over in Wheeler Hall in the Mod 5 room at 6 o'clock this evening. And then next Monday, November 13th, Bonnie Honig will deliver this year's Una's lecture, Fatal Forgiveness, Euripides, Austen, Arendt, Cavell. And I want to note that if you're planning to attend Honig's talk, I'd recommend you not only brush up on your Hippolytus, but also watch John Stahl's film Leave Her to Heaven, which is going to be sort of central, the first noir film made in color, which is going to be central to Bonnie's talk. And then on Tuesday, November 14th, Marianne Constable, Mario Telo, and Dora Zhang will offer their responses to the lecture. Both of those events will take place again over in Wheeler Hall in the Mod 5 room, starting at 5. So that's all for now. Aglaya, we're eager to hear about Rodchenko and Stalin. So I turn to
Rodchenko.
Thank you, Stephen. So welcome to everyone here in the room, in the Jabal room. And we're here to find out more about, to celebrate, and to acknowledge the very first book by Aglaya Glebova, beautifully produced by Yale University Press. Path-breaking, I think, beautifully written as well, and subtly conceived. So congratulations, first of all, Aglaya, for a really substantial achievement.
Thank you.
Aglaya asked me to begin today's conversation with what might be like a 3-4 minute, summation of the book, a somewhat daunting task because it's so intricately written and conceived. But here goes. And what we're going to do is you'll hear a very brief summary of the book and its achievements from me. And then I'm going to invite Aglaya to either respond to my thoughts or alternatively just jump into the text, take a look at the table of contents and some images that we might discuss together before throwing the conversation open to all of you. So again, Aglaya, congratulations. And I think that most people in the audience will know Rodchenko in a few canonical ways as a significant figure in 20th century photography, who is remembered chiefly for his association with the Soviet avant-garde, members of which he photographed, such as Mayakovsky, the Bricks, Stepanova, his partner, for his montage-based designs for book covers, as well as advertising posters during the NEF era, but also for his oblique angled images of courtyards, of street life, and of Soviet collective festivity, viewed, as he put it, from any point but the belly button. To specialists in the region, that is to say, in the Soviet Union, with some area studies knowledge, Rodchenko is also known as straddling two distinct eras in Russian and Soviet history. The first post-revolutionary decade associated with the heroic days of the constructivist avant-garde and some degree of aesthetic freedom. And then the subsequent decade, which was bookended on the one hand by the first 5-year plan promulgated in 1928, and on the other hand by the Great Terror of 1937-1938. All, or at least most accounts of the Soviet avant-garde then are compelled to negotiate, on the one hand, the utopian enthusiasms, but also, on the other hand, the coercive constraints of the revolutionary epoch and ascendant Stalinism. And all of them struggle to reconcile, in some ways, personal artistic agency with the pressures of history, or as Stephen Best so brutally put it, Rodchenko and Stalin. So if I had to summarize the book's contents in a nutshell, it would be this. Aglaya's book offers a comprehensive introduction to Rodchenko's work, and in fact, Andrei Popov, University of Chicago, calls it the most important book on Rodchenko to date. It is also one, I think, that goes beyond simply any kind of introductory familiarization to something, I think, much more subtle and serious, which is a narrative that acknowledges, on the one hand, Rodchenko's constitutive role in the constructivist avant-garde and also in Stalinist state building. But at the same time, what I think Aglaya does, and this is going to be the key term, the operative term that basically informs the analytical work of the book as a whole, what Aglaya does essentially is discern in the corpus of Rodchenko's photography what she calls a shadow oeuvre, right? So what is this shadow oeuvre? Well, let me tell you, first of all, what it isn't. It doesn't correspond to any kind of art historical or historiographical break between certain kinds of binaries, such as modernism versus socialist realism, or the avant-garde versus Stalinism. Nor does it correspond to any specific set of thematic choices, genres, or even subject matter. Rather, Aglaya suggests this shadow oeuvre relates to a wide spectrum of subjects, from landscapes, cityscapes, portraits, and still lifes. It is found in individual works as well as in series, in works both with and without the element of montage. What characterizes this shadow oeuvre is heterogeneity, is multiplicity, is eclecticism, and occasionally even radical opacity. The shadow oeuvre is experimental, but at the same time, its experimentation should not be seen as coterminous with avant-gardism, because it is also backward-looking and turning to seemingly unmodern forms. It corresponds neither to modernist experimentation then, nor to the return to tradition or figuration that some have seen to characterize Stalinist 1930s. So in an era of temporal acceleration associated above all, of course, with the first five-year plan of rapid industrialization and collectivization, Aglaya posits Rodchenko's work as non-linear, inhabiting what she calls a zigzag or seesaw process. Right? It should be emphasized that this sense of non-synchronicity, if you will, is not necessarily the result of montage, which, as you know, has a programmatic interest in juxtaposing visually or historically distinct phenomena. Rather, what Aglaya calls our attention to, or rather what the shadow oeuvre calls attention to, is what she calls the pressures of randomness, contingency, and the coexistence of the old and the new. So if I had to summarize Aglaya's achievement in this book, I would say that it's an exemplary form of close reading, or I should say, since I'm amongst art historians, close looking and slow looking, which is applied to obviously a very privileged body of work, Rodchenko's canonical figure, after all, in photography, but which serves to dislodge the familiar narrative of Rodchenko himself as a photographer, but also of his relationship to the ascendant Soviet project of modernization. For students of literary and art history more generally, particularly those working in regions that are almost always overdetermined by political history, which turns out to be much of the globe increasingly, I think, right? I think what Aglaya teaches us is to read a body of work subtly and also against the grain, right? Not so much as apolitical or political, but rather working alongside, in tandem with, and in some form of critical engagement with the political. I think the big question that Aglaya poses and asks all of us in this room perhaps to rethink is this. Was the modernity of photography as a technological and artistic medium necessarily synchronous with Soviet modernity as a political project, whether in its utopian promise or its coercive realization? And given how inescapable and all-pervasive Soviet modernity was, I think the achievement of this book then, which is both huge but also hugely subtle, is in showing us what we might call an early Soviet shadow world, right? A kind of, if you like, Soviet chiaroscuro. On that note, I might turn the floor over to Aglaya for her response and also her introduction to it.
Thank you, Harsha. It's really a delight to be in conversation with you. And yes, I will try. And also to get your sense of the book and your very thoughtful engagement. And I also just want to say that it's really nice to see so many faces here of people with whom I've been in conversation about this book for a very long time now. And in fact, in what now feels like a quite different life, the first version of the third chapter of this book was presented here when I was a graduate student fellow at the Townsend Center a decade ago. So I want to maybe quickly first trace the way that this book unfolds for those who are not, who haven't had a chance to read it or not familiar with it. And here I've put up the table of contents, which begins with an introduction about the temporality of Rodchenko's work. And what Harsha has spoken to in terms of the kind of hyper acceleration of the late 1920s and 1930s of Soviet modernity going into overdrive in often very forced and ruthless ways, right, top down. And part of what really intrigued me about this moment in Rodchenko's work, though I think that he is just one figure that we can take as emblematic of this, is that it's precisely at this moment of kind of hyper-modernization, which would seem to have fulfilled a lot of the avant-garde dreams of industrial futurity, of a linear sense of progress, of an almost futurist, actually, remaking of the world. It's at this moment that Rodchenko suddenly begins to slow his photography down and turn to ideas of prolongation, even dwelling, arrest in his photographs, departing very much from his own earlier ideas of what good modernist photography should do, which is to be serial, rapid, and mass reproducible. So the idea of contemporaneity here is also the idea of living within different kinds of temporal strata that are coexistent in the Soviet 1930s, rather than simply positing to a kind of perfect future world, right? Or a world in the process of modernization. And I'll speak a little bit more about what I mean by this in the next slide, but the book develops largely chronologically. So from the mid-1920s, when Rodchenko really picks up photography and starts to think of himself as a photographer, to the late 1930s, when he by and large actually abandons photography as a medium and starts to make studio-bound paintings of very performative subjects. So a lot of circus scenes, there's some sad clowns in there, and there's not going to show you those, but there's a self-portrait of Rodchenko painting of him as a sad clown playing a trombone, which from 1939, which tells you, I think, quite a lot actually about, right, that moment too. But he really abandons the sense of photography as connected to the reality of the world, and I think in part because he feels that he has to abandon that project in light of what the world has become, essentially. But he begins as an urban photographer by and large, and so that's the first chapter, Perspectives in the Collective, which deal with his urban photographs of the 1920s, early 1930s. And then I look at his often some iconic portrait photographs of the revolutionary poet Vladimir Mayakovsky, which have become kind of textbook images of the sexy vanguard, right, of the 1920s, to this kind of circle of his friends. There was actually an exhibit in Moscow a few years ago called Stylish People, Rodchenko's Circle, of his photographs of this vanguard. to then his kind of pioneer series, for which he was condemned as overly formalist, and also some lesser known works. For example, a graphic design of a cover on the very first Soviet show trial that used found newsreel footage, but was actually published by a state publishing press. And then for chapters 3 and 4, which was kind of the genesis of this book, I'm looking at Rodchenko's extensive 50-page, very complex visually photo essay for a journal called USSR in Construction, which was a lavishly illustrated propaganda journal published in multiple languages. And Rodchenko does a photo essay on the White Sea Baltic Canal construction site, which is one of the very first Soviet gulags, forced labor camps. And the reason that this was also the kind of heart of the book from the get-go is because that work had been so overdetermined in our understanding of Soviet art. It was seen as a kind of limit case, like this is where avant-garde turns bad, this is where avant-garde turns Stalinist. And I actually found that there was almost a kind of willful blindness in a scholarship on this work, in which it was read as necessarily only expressing the official point of view. But the work, I argue, is actually far more ambivalent and complex and fraught than that. And there's a whole body of work that Rodchenko does at the site that doesn't make it into publication, but presents kind of elegiac sidelines, I would say, to that project. And the final chapter, The Photographer's Hand, turns to very strange photographs that Rodchenko overpainted in the 1930s, while he's also blacking out kind of the unfavorable class enemies as a parallel censorship project. But I read these retouched photographs as also a sign of a certain kind of haptic care, actually, and almost a counterpoint to this blacking out. And that work actually began also in a seminar taught by Darcy Grigsby, who's here in the back, also 15 years ago, on photography and painting. So just to give you a sense also of what I mean by the shadow over, I'm showing you here 2 images by Rodchenko. On the left, one of his very early, perhaps the earliest photo series that he does, called the Mysnitskaya Street series. It's a series of photographs he takes of the courtyard, essentially, where he lives for the rest of his life until 1956, until his death. And these are kind of the canonical Rodchenko photographs, right? They show us these oblique, dramatic angles, defamiliarizing views. They're all about the play of shadow. And also on the left, the writing out of everything that is everyday and inhabited about it. And part of what this photograph on the left does is that it also actually ushers in a reality that's not yet there. It takes a pre-revolutionary, actually somewhat outdated building, brick construction, right? Certainly not a skyscraper, and tries to turn it into something like a radically modern form. And on the right is an image from 2830, which is taken in the same courtyard, except now from Rodchenko's apartment rather than from the street level, gazing down. And this is also the cover image. And one of the reasons that I love this work so much is because it's definitely a canonical kind of Rodchenko, right? We also have this oblique angle, dramatic diagonals. All of this is here. It's also part of the series. But it also gives us a more expansive view of what modernity and modern life might look like, including the fact that now we actually have these details of inhabitation that the photographer turns from trying to organize the space. And Rodchenko is really, really interested and invested in organizing spaces in high modernist ways in the 1920s, right? He complains that the city is too topsy-turvy. It hasn't reached this point of kind of perfect urban modernity yet. And then by 1928, suddenly we have this very unradical urban geography of a circumscribed block of domestic details that are closest to the photographer, and even of varying degrees of collectivity. And we might think of this as also disclosing to us a certain kind of modernity in the process of becoming, right? A form of collectivity that's literally about to turn the corner in its perfectly assembled shape, but is not quite there yet. But also domestic details and kind of individuals, including women who are wearing dresses that would have been anathema to constructivists and productivists 5 years ago. Feminine designs, floral patterns, traditionally feminine cuts, all of that 3 years ago would have been seen as residual of the pre-revolutionary bourgeois era. But here, Rodchenko actually leaves it in, and not only does it leave it in, but he also overpaints it. It's a little bit hard to see, but he returns to this print with crayon and pencil in hand, highlighting the irregularities of the crowd, even the pattern, right, the floral pattern on this woman's dress. There are other moments like the kind of the mattress and that's hanging out to dry and so on. So highlighting these different moments within the print rather than organizing it. But the reason that I also place this as a shadow over is because these works have been very much overshadowed by their more modernist counterparts. So this image, this photograph, you can see reproduced in a lot of catalogs in its black and white version. But I didn't know that the overpainted version existed until I went to Moscow. And then it turned out that there were dozens of them. And this version actually, which is the cover of the book, is one of two, which is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, in which I discovered in my final year of finishing this book. So I suspect there's still actually dozens of images that I haven't been able to track down that would belong to something like this eclectic shadow over. And I'm very interested in retouching in Rodchenko also because it troubles our ideas of a kind of linear modernism, right? From painting to abstract painting to mass media, to maybe something like socialist realism in the Soviet case. And here we suddenly have this return of the photographer's hand, of painting, of the unique print and the singular print to the scene of what's usually considered a moment of mass reception and mass reproduction. So maybe I'll pause here, but I also have more slides.
But I think that, I mean, I would love to talk more about this, but I'm also concerned about the time. And I think it would be really useful to look at the Biélemont Canal moment and your rereading of it, because I think that's perhaps the crux of the book. And so I think the audience would be very much interested in thinking about what your intervention is, because that's that nodal point where the avant-garde is supposedly shipwrecks against the shoals of high Stalinism. So I think people would be very much interested in knowing where your argument goes.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a quick preface about the history of this photo essay, which is that in 1933, Rodchenko goes to the White Sea-Baltic Canal as a freelancer for Eitzete, so a German communist journal. And part of his interest in going there is that he's kind of trying to recover his cultural cachet after being critiqued for formalism. And I think he has very little sense of where he's actually going to end up when he goes. He thinks it's a kind of industrial construction site and is shocked. We don't get this sense from the letters. Of course, they're quite coded, but discovers that it's a forced labor camp on an extreme scale. The sense that we get of the fact that this was a surprise is actually from his life partner's letters, Varvara Stepanova, who is writing him from Moscow, and her letters get increasingly agitated as she talks to more and more people about where Rodchenko is. So she goes and talks to the editor of USSR in Construction and says, well, Rodchenko's there. Do you want a photo essay on it? And then her next letter to Rodchenko says, I haven't heard from you in 2 weeks. Where are you? The editor is deeply concerned that you're there without a permit, and we're sending you authorization to be a USSR construction correspondent. But this issue is generally seen as a kind of unfettered adulation of Stalinism and a total obfuscation of the realities of the camp on the ground, which to a large extent it is, because of course we don't see the actual costs, the human costs of this construction. But I think we get something like the sense of the constructions of what I call the engineered chaos, right? The fabricated chaos of its making. And in particular, Rodchenko actually returns to photo montage, which he abandons in the late 1920s, because he sees it as non-documentary enough, right? And it's the singular photograph that becomes a true document because it can speak on its own and because it hasn't been altered or somehow manipulated in the sense of the hand's intervention. And suddenly in USSR in construction, we have something like this photo montage, which has probably 36 images combined by hand in order to create this kind of overwhelming vista of a construction site where the natural space has been totally upturned and made illegible, but yet nothing coherent has yet emerged from it. And one of the arguments that I make is that he turns to photo montage because photography alone without the montage cannot mimic or capture the labor being done at the site, which was also largely performed by hand without technology, without dynamite. But also on a scale that even serial photography couldn't capture. But what also really interests me about this moment is that Rodchenko, so the project is framed as a kind of reforging, right? That's the policy of making socialist, or let's say reluctant subjects into good socialist entities through work at the site. And among these reluctant subjects is actually nature or landscape. And the ideology of the construction is very much about turning nature to human advantage. That's just part of its ideology. And Rodchenko is this avant-gardist who, in the 1920s, hates nature. Finds it profoundly boring, too disorganized, too organic, right, out of sync with what the contemporary world should be, and complains about how when he goes into the countryside, there's nothing to photograph. The only things you can take photos of are pines because they kind of look like telegraph poles. And then he goes to the canal and we get this large body of landscape and still lives that totally dwell in an almost picturesque sense of place and very much in the disorganization and even stagnation of nature, the opposite of this kind of conversion into industrial shape or something like nature organized to human advantage. So this is the back cover of the book. And this image was never published, as far as I know, in Rodchenko's lifetime, along with many other landscapes from the canal. But it also gives us a sense, I would argue, of Rodchenko trying to fit some of these misfit shapes back into the picture of the site or to recover them. So the cast-offs of both organic decay with the birch trunk on the right, but also of something like construction or handmaidedness, the debarked log, the petal on the left, right, that have been immobilized by this algae, as also deserving of being pictured and of documentation in photographs that really are not interested in moving forward at all, not compositionally, not in terms of content. And there are other landscapes that he also overpaints in a way that looks like 19th century landscape painting, again, something that would have been anathema to him just 5 years prior. So my reading of this work is also that actually in encountering the really extreme, right, really radical version of modernity put to this kind of state use, Rodchenko actually begins to construct different forms that don't seem critical in the language of conventional high modernism, but actually are critical of the project of the moment. So part of this work for me is also to rehabilitate the kinds of forms or recuperate the kinds of forms that seem backward looking, that seem 19th century or pictorialist, and don't fit into this linear narrative of what a progressive modernism might look like.
If you were to, I mean, if that is sort of the arc, right, a non-linear arc, is there any sense that the shadow over that you discover is either a constant co-presence, or if it's one that actually radicalizes itself in a reactive sense to the acceleration of Soviet modernity? In other words, the question I have, which is not entirely, I think, answered by the book, is that you want to actually, on the one hand, posit the shadow over as a kind of perennial, right, in order to be able to dismantle the dominant narratives, art historical and political narratives of this time and place. On the other hand, you also want to see it as being in some ways reactive and potentially critical, or if not in the mode of direct critique, of some form of disjunction or detachment, right? So I'm still wondering how to sort of map that onto a much more conventional notion of the 1920s and the 1930s, at least as far as his work is concerned.
Yeah, it's a great question, which I'm also actually not sure that I have a linear answer to or a definitive answer to, but I think we need to take seriously the eclectic forms of modernism that don't fit into linear narratives, and that's work that's been ongoing for some time, but I think is still not, has not, let's say, overwritten or definitively, that's seen as equally important to our understanding of 20th century art. And I think the kind of eclecticism was actually present throughout his career. And if we look at the 1920s, we can find it there too, like his Workers' Club, which we usually read as a sign of or a representation of constructivist interest in transparency, efficiency, and economy of form, is also profoundly informed by the Viennese design school of the 1900s and Art Deco. But these forms are kind of buried or sublated within a constructivist concern with form. But I do think that this intensifies. I mean, he's clearly a very heterogeneous and also kind of omnivorous artist, right? Like he's looking at everything all the time. But a certain way of counteracting what he encounters in the world becomes more extreme in the 1930s and much more pronounced. So I would say that it's a perennial concern, but it intensifies as he encounters versions of his own earlier beliefs that are so extreme that he can no longer espouse them.
I see, yeah. Perhaps one last question before I sort of throw the conversation open to the audience, and stepping back a little bit to think about what this book is, what kind of story this book presents, right? It's a story about Rodchenko, to be sure, and it's a story about how photography, even if it cannot halt time, it can at least obscure it or render it multiple by pointing to the kind of multiple spatialities co-present in the now, including, as you pointed out, the presence of nature, right, in construction, alongside construction. So if that's the story you're telling, I guess the question I had is this. I mean, on the one hand, you want to dispense with certain kinds of categories such as modernism, right? At the same time, it struck me that in many ways, what you're really showing us is the persistence of modernism understood in a different way. That is to say, there's a story that I think all of us in literary history and art history are familiar with. From a literary perspective, it would be the story of, say, this modernism from Baudelaire to the French surrealists, right? Which is this idea of an aesthetic modernism that functions as an implicit critique of political or historical modernity, not in the form of kind of direct attack, but rather through some notion of indeterminacy, difficulty, or opacity, right? And of slowing down, if you like, of perception. And if that's the case, then I think you've perhaps, and here's sort of the question I want to pose is, aren't you really telling us the story of the fact that Rodchenko is, after all, a modernist? And that this is, again, a story of how modernism, aesthetic modernism, deals with historical modernity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A great question. I think, yeah, I don't manage to dispense with modernism as a category, and I'm not sure that I fully want to. But I think the kind of modernism, let's say, that Rodchenko's later work performs is a different one from the one performed by his earlier work. And I think about this also, I mean, of course, Shklovsky's idea of defamiliarization as actually slowing down perception is something that comes back in the 1930s unexpectedly, maybe, as opposed to the rapidity or the emphasis on accelerating perception or changing it through disjuncture, fragmentation, shock, disruption of the 1920s. And I think, in that sense, I remain, at least within this book, very much a modernist, right? And that I'm thinking too about the ways that critical forms change over time. And actually, the left front of the arts and Rodchenko and company very much themselves spoke to in the 1920s of the fact that there are no eternally critical forms. In order to remain critical, the forms have to change. And that once everybody starts photographing like Rodchenko will have to find a different way to photograph, right? Because that will become co-opted essentially, and no longer critical or defamiliarizing. But part of what also troubles, I think, this idea of criticality, actually, is that these forms of the shadow oeuvre really are very hard to mobilize. And it's partly because I think Rodchenko is creating them in opposition to ideas of mobilization, circulation, dissemination, right, as kind of an attempt not to, on the sidelines, get co-opted. But it also means that when the Soviet avant-garde gets picked up again in World War II photojournalism, or in the 1960s with the so-called thaw and de-Stalinization, the forms that reemerge are the forms of the 1920s, which were all about mass viewership, mobilization, apparativity. And the forms of the shadow oeuvre basically stay in the shadows, right, until...
So they don't become available, crucially, right, for appropriation and for transformative purposes. Right?
That would be, my answer.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a good moment to see if there are questions from the audience. Perhaps we can have the lights on as well.
Yeah, I think now we can have a little more illumination.
We can see you now.
This on? Okay. Thank you for the presentation. I'm really curious about this idea of a greater heterogeneity in our accounts of the 1920s and 1930s. I was struck, though, by the beginning of the presentation when you mentioned that Rodchenko is representative of a larger process going on. So I'm curious what other characters or phenomena are on your timeline, on your map. How is that different, for example, from, let's say, a case study in literature, such as Daniel Harms, about whom we always think about the avant-garde phase in the 1920s, and then the neoclassicism during the 1930s, which is not necessarily the Stalinist kind of classicism, but one developing on the other side of the spectrum. Who else is turning back to Art Deco?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, not Art Deco, but in terms of different ways of structuring history, even Dziga Vertov the filmmaker in the late 1920s actually turns to kind of residual histories, right? So when you look at the Symphony of the Donbass, actually, the opening scenes show us a Scythian skeleton in the strata of time that are re-emerging actually as a result of Soviet modernization, right? The excavation of the past suddenly becomes, through excavation of the past, it becomes coterminous with a kind of futuristic present. So even in the makers cultural producers who we think of as hyper avant-gardist and futurist like Vertov, I think we actually see this occurring in the late 1920s. But we could also think of the organic school of the Russian avant-garde, which largely sticks with ideas of the organic and an interest in things like interactions of color. But they remain with that throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, or someone like Filonov with analytic theories of universal blossoming. We can also think about Malevich and his return to figuration, which is often thought of, right, as a regressive move, as a kind of falling back, a refusal of abstraction because it's no longer desirable or possible in public Soviet space. But I think we can actually offer an alternative account of that return that would read it not as some sort of forced abandonment of radical modernism, but as a different kind of modernism, right? That, for example, responds to the violence or even maybe dehumanization of the moment with collectivization by reintroducing the human to the space of art, right? So yeah, I think there are quite a few, and that's just looking at the canonical guys. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Aglaya. I think that one of the really important moves that you do by emphasizing Rodchenko's sort of eclecticism is also, prod at or it sort of dispel the idea that I also think has overdetermined modernism and its historicization, which is a story about ruination and only ruination and repair, like
ruination.
Ruination, like the farewell to an idea, like that kind of sense of loss that pervades so much of modernist historicizing. And I think that insofar as in certain instances, Rodchenko is making reparative gestures that does sort of cycle back, but he's making reparative gestures at the same time as he's working against the reparative. So I'm thinking about the moment in your book where you talk about the trial with the wreckers and how the wreckers who go on strike are categorized in this sort of completely obscene negative way, but Rodchenko's poster for it it could be read in some ways as reparative, but it actually does something completely different. It sort of reshuffles that image of wreckage as well. So if he's working against linearity and progress, he's also not necessarily just going back and repairing. And I think that sort of move toward eclecticism will help us kind of get away from the historicity of modern.
Yeah, I mean, both of those coexist, right? And they're simultaneous. So kind of actually hyper-propagandistic work, which I do try to read a little bit against the grain, but also have to admit that there is a kind of hard limit on how against the grain that work can be read, right? Coexists with the shadow over. And I think there's something to be said for delving into the kind of thickness and the murkiness, right? Like the knotty nature, like Knotty, not the murkiness, not the other kind of naughtiness, of that moment, and that these artists also, I mean, they have to work in, right, or kind of thicken their work if they want to do things other than posters for show trials or photographs of Moscow yesterday and tomorrow. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that this eclecticism is also about something that is simultaneous and seems like the synchronicity of the unsynchronous, but actually exists at the same time.
Thank you. Awesome. I'm thinking about the question of contingency in relation to photography because the two go together so often. I suppose contingency and modernism more broadly. I'm thinking about that in relation to temporality. If we think about contingency as the temporality of the snapshot or the moment, it seems as though you are offering almost like a different history of contingency, which might be the contingency of like duration, or natural processes that occur over a long span of time. So I guess my question is, what is your account, or do you think there's something to be said about photography and contingency in relation to this shadow oeuvre?
Yeah, I think contingency would be closer in some ways to the non-shadow oeuvre, right, of high modernist photography, new vision. But there is also contingency in the return to the print that Rodchenko performs at various times and in various ways as well. So I don't know that I can offer some sort of theory of shadow oeuvre's relationship to contingency, other than to say that I wouldn't draw a hard line of contingency belonging only to the avant-garde work, right? Or notions of high modernism.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Aglaya. I really appreciated your book and your.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, it's not working.
I can hear you. I can rephrase.
Okay, go ahead. All right.
So I was juggling a lot of context, and you're very careful where you draw the line between the personal and the political and the contingent. And yet I return, having grown up in that environment, to the coded messages, because as you mentioned just now, he had to work to make a living. He had to belong to some organization in order to get work. Therefore, he had to do what he was supposed to do. Hence the coding. And I know that if we've had this conversation before, so when I would push you on the coding, and that what I see here coded is a critique that, especially in the portraits with the circus and his self-portrait as a said clown. And so the question, I guess, is why are you resisting that line of thought?
You have it?
But I don't have the sad clown one because it's too sad, but but I have these. And I think I mean, and it's kind of extraordinary, right? This return to total artifice. And actually Rodchenko was also a son of theater Propman, so stage designer in a kind of low gray cabaret space. And so he starts increasingly in his diaries talking about growing up above the stage and defamiliarization from birth. But it's also, you know, I think this photograph of him with this work is also kind of a representation of the artist walking that tightrope, right? Of kind of acrobatic self-transformation, essentially, where also this early constructivist instrument of the compass and the rulers suddenly becomes the balancing stick of the acrobat in this photograph. But I don't know that I'm so much resisting the idea of critique as I'm trying to, I mean, I don't want to make Rodchenko into a dissident figure, because there were actual dissidents, right, who did the hard work of open resistance or semi-open resistance in the way that Rodchenko didn't. And, you know, most of them paid dearly for it, or who wrote, you know, into their desks to document the realities of the day, knowing full well that they were risking their lives potentially, but that Rodchenko doesn't do this. So I am careful to walk that line of trying to decode, perhaps, right, the critique or the reading of the moment. But also, I don't want to suggest that there's some sort of heroic resistance in the public sphere that Rodchenko is carrying out. Does that answer your question?
We don't have that much time, but I am mindful that Darcy had her hand up before. Just go ahead. And maybe Victoria too.
Aglaya, let me say what a stunning book this is, and what a stunning reading you make of that last photograph of the two logs. I've been looking at that with you now for 15 years, maybe, and I just am stunned by it. And when someone's bringing up contingency being defined differently, I mean, this is about contingency where the two logs happen to be there in the flow, but there is such a longue durée of being able to read this in a very slow way, and you do justice to that in ways that people often don't. You make us see it more slowly, and I think that's an incredible achievement. So thank you. I just wanted to say that, but you know what I'm gonna say? I'm gonna say Stepanova and women, please.
Yeah. Yeah. If I were to rewrite this book, yeah.
Anything you want to say?
Well, I mean, she does figure in it mostly toward, I mean, she figures in it as a thinker of the moment as well as a chronicler, right? And we would have really a far scantier picture of this moment without her. And she is the person who sits down and actually takes the labor and the time to document, right? And think about and writing this moment as well.
You know, that's another book.
The-
Number 2, this book, that was longer.
Not by me, but not by me, because I want to move away from this particular moment. But I will say there's a book by Olivia Croft on partly Stepanova coming out. So I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah. Thanks, Darcy.
I feel we've probably run out of time. So please join me in thanking Aglaya Glebova.
Oh. Thanks so much for coming and for your wonderful questions. It's really great to see you
And if you'd like
here.
to take a look at the book, please come up and peruse